From the National Museum of African American Music in Nashville, Tennessee, this is Just Conversations, presented by the Metro Human Relations Commission.
Hi, and welcome to this episode of Just Conversations on how the pandemic has affected immigrant farm workers. We are filming at the National Museum of African American Music, and I'm here with my two panelists, Caitlin Berberich and Arturo Salomon, and I'm going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves. Caitlin.
Hi, my name is Caitlin Berberich. I am the Director of Southern Migrant Legal Services, which is a project of Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid.
My name is Arturo Salomon. I am the Operations Coordinator at the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition here in Nashville.
Thank you both. So our topic today is how the pandemic has affected immigrant farm workers. And Arturo, although you now work at TIRC, the Tennessee Immigrant Refugee Rights Coalition, you also have experience as a farm worker.
Yes.
And I think your dad still works on a farm.
Yes, that's correct.
So maybe you could tell me what you have observed in terms of the effects of the pandemic.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, for having us here first. And one of the things that I was thinking about mentioning is that a lot of the issues that we've been facing during the pandemic is the fear, fear of losing the jobs, especially my dad, mainly because he still works at the farm where I used to work. And back then when we were just kind of like hiding at our homes, because I felt like that's what we were doing, even though we still had to work during the pandemic. My dad had the fear of losing his job because he doesn't have any documentation that certifies him that he's a citizenship in this country. And even though I had that, we were afraid that the farm was just completely going to collapse, that we were not going to have any source of income, because we didn't know how long this was going to be or how bad it was going to get. And my dad, at some point, he started considering that maybe if everything got worse, we were going to head back to Mexico. And that's something that I disagree on strongly, because I wasn't going to go back to a country that it was struggling more. And I think we had a few friends that they completely lost their job, because their farms they were not having any sorts of like income anymore, and like they had to close down the farms, and some of them had to go back to their home countries. And then we're here like a year and a half after, and then it seems like things are getting a little bit better, but they cannot come back anymore, because now they made that choice of going back to their home countries, and they're not in the position where they can afford to come back anymore. So yeah, and thankfully, my dad still works there. The pandemic didn't affect us that much, but did affect us in a way where we were we were doubting whether we were gonna keep working there or not, whether our boss was gonna be like, guys, we cannot, have the same operations like as every day for a little while, because we were, they were affected by it, or I don't know. We were like unsure what was gonna happen. Especially since he has a few other farms in Kentucky and North Carolina. We find out that some of the employees got sick. So we were afraid that was going to be this is it, we're shutting down for a little while. So coming from like a Hispanic and Latinx family, it was really hard to think like we were not going to be working, because we have no help from any source of like government organization. So yes.
Well, it's not like you're going to get unemployment. Like
exactly. We were not.
So many other people were able to get when the pandemic
exactly.
started.
My dad is 72. He still works at a farm because he cannot, apply for to retire or for unemployment, so that's his, his life right now.
That says a lot that he's 72 and still having to do that kind of work.
Yes.
Thank you. Caitlin, so I know that your organization, you are doing work in 6 states in the South on behalf of migrants and immigrants.
Yes, so my organization, Southern Migrant Legal Services, we are a special project of a larger legal aid organization called Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid. So we basically offer free legal representation to eligible workers related to their employment. And our organization specializes in representing farm workers, agricultural workers specifically. And so we are representing farm workers in not only Tennessee, but also in Kentucky, in Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas. So, we are a small office and, we're spread thin across the area. And unfortunately, we do see lots of abuse and exploitation of farm workers. And I would really agree a lot with what Arturo was saying about, in terms of how the pandemic has impacted farm workers specifically. For example, last year, the volume of intakes that we got from workers was actually down. And I think a big part of that was really fear-based, is that, the workers that we're dealing with, they're used to exploitation. That's not new, but when you're in a pandemic, workers who were already in a desperate situation became even more desperate. And so, no one wanted to lose their jobs. And I think the fear of losing their job was above everything else. Even above, honestly, in a lot of situations, their own health, because we did see lots of situations where employers were not doing enough to protect workers from COVID.
What is sort of the daily reality of that for people working on farms during the pandemic? Was it just, oh my goodness, we need to step up production, or we need to, circle the wagons and protections are going out the door?
It's interesting because during the pandemic, a lot of industries shut down. So if you, worked in a different, labor market than a farm worker, you may have stopped working totally. You may have lost your job, or you may have moved to remote working or something like that. But farm work cannot be done remotely, and farm workers were considered to be essential workers. And so the policy of the administration was to actually kick farm work, agricultural work into high gear. And there was really this emphasis on the need to make sure that the food supply chain didn't stop, even though the rest of the economy was shutting down. And so, nothing ever slowed down for farm workers. They still had to come into work every single day. I would say, if anything, they were coming under conditions that were even less safe than they had previously been. Agriculture has always been an industry with high rates of injury, but during the pandemic, I do think that it got worse. In our jobs, for example, we deal with a lot of workers who are on what's called an H-2A visa. So there's this special visa program that is run by the federal government that allows growers, farmers, to petition the government to bring in workers from abroad to come work in the U.S. temporarily on visas. And a lot of those workers do come from Mexico, the majority, I would say. And even though the country was closing down the borders to other kinds of immigration to prevent COVID from spreading into the U.S., farm workers, or workers coming on these H-2A visas, were a special exception to that. And so there were actually less protections in place because a lot of the government agencies were shut down, but they were still shuttling workers in, as quickly as they could. And I am not aware of any sort of protections that were put in place for farm workers that were being brought in during this time. For example, I'm not aware of any social distancing that was happening in the transportation process. I mean, most workers are just, crammed into these buses, crossed the border into the U.S., traveling from wherever they were in Mexico up to anywhere in the U.S. No social distancing, no testing, no vaccinations were offered to people. And so the workers themselves were being put at risk. The government did not do very much to protect workers during that process.
This is so interesting because I think this is something that most people, if they don't know about this world, don't know anything about. Sure. Why would they not have testing or vaccinations for people. I would think that would, help the greater society as a whole if the farm workers were protected as well.
I mean, I would personally think the same thing. So I can't really answer why they didn't do that. We saw the same thing when workers arrived at farms. Most farm workers are living in employer-provided housing for various reasons. And within the H-2A program in particular, employers are required to provide housing. And it's congregate-style housing where workers are, like bunk beds, like they're living in very close quarters. And we did see lots of outbreaks at farms because of none of these preventative measures having taken place. But no, to answer the question of like why they didn't, I don't have an answer to that either, other than apparently the institutions didn't like care enough to organize that. They were more focused, I think, on the economics of the business, not like the protections of the workers' rights.
Yeah, just comes down to money. Arturo, were you about to say something?
No, I was going to agree with that, and I think a lot of that, and that's on my personal opinion. I could be wrong, but it feels like they're immigrants coming to work here. They're not really U.S. citizens. I don't think that they were going to be spending money on trying to like help other immigrants. Even though they're working here, we became not a priority during those times. And I remember a few times where I was talking to some of the community members, like around Murfreesboro, and they were saying like, some clinics were not even accepting them, for their appointments.
Some clinics were not even accepting them.
Yeah.
Why? What was the?
Because of the fear of spreading the virus, but mainly because, they were not citizens, so they were not going to be prioritizing them.
Wow.
And that's something not everybody knows. That's something that's still like a dilemma nowadays. And then it's been a year and it's still happening. And I feel like whatever happened with these farmers coming from Mexico, it was just that, like they were not being marked as like, okay, let's protect them, let's prioritize them because, they're saving out our economy by working during the pandemic, even though nobody else is. They were just, like a pawn, like in a game of like chess.
Yeah, that's really ironic that these people that are literally helping us all eat throughout the pandemic would have such low value.
Yes. And then again, I can be wrong, but it seems with everything that's been happening, everything that I've been listening now that I work with the Turk, that's what I like. It's coming from there. Like we're not being seen as a priority, or part of the community, here in the United States, just because of the simple purpose that like we come from another country.
I wonder if either of you see any way around having this sort of underclass of people who have less rights because they're not documented or they don't have the same status as a citizen. Is there any solution? Is there any path forward? Is there any way to ameliorate things? I mean, you're an actual immigrant from Mexico. What do you think?
I think a lot has been talked with Congress. A lot has been said, with our current president. But it seems like we're focusing on other things right now. That even, like our essential workers are still not even part of the talk. With the whole situation that we have right now with like the immigration reform or like the DREAM Act, like the DACA.
DREAM Act.
Yeah, it
DACA,
seems like they just keep pushing it away. They just keep putting it aside because they want to focus on other things for us and then still leave us, at the side. And that's coming from, like I said, coming from somebody who's been dealing with this for years. It comes to the point like whatever they say in the Congress or whatever they say in the government is like, this is one more promise that they're not going to fulfill. So, and that's, like I said, my personal opinion. And then still, it creates a lot of fear, within the community. And then creates a lot of doubt, saying like, what's going to happen? But to have a solution on that, I wouldn't be able to answer that because at this point, it's hard to believe what's coming from the White House or what's coming from Congress. So
Yeah, I wonder if either of you think there's been any difference since there was a change in administration.
I mean, there have been some changes on the fringes. I mean, I don't want to reduce the value of those changes. They are important. I think recently the administration put out a new statement about ICE stopping to do so much enforcement at workplaces, because we have seen situations where there is a work site where workers speak up about problems that are being experienced there, and then suddenly there will be a massive ICE intervention. And a lot of people probably have heard about the big raid that happened a few years ago in Mississippi at some of the poultry plants down there. But some of those plants not long before that had, at one of the plants in particular, a bunch of workers had filed a lawsuit that the EEOC had been involved in litigating.
Sorry, for people who don't know, the EEOC
is the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission. So they are the government agency that looks into various forms of discrimination against workers. So, that's a good thing. There shouldn't be ICE enforcement happening at workplace locations where workers are trying to pursue their rights. Those are steps in the right direction. But I think that in terms of your question, I mean, I could talk a lot about sort of wonky legal issues in terms of, there's just a lot of systemic barriers currently in place that do discriminate against farm workers and leave them sort of legally in a worse off position. So for example, farm workers continue to not be eligible for overtime. So the major statute, which is the Fair Labor Standards Act that provides for minimum wage protections and overtime, still excludes farm workers. So
Why is that? That is really interesting.
Originally, when the act was passed, it also excluded farm workers from minimum wage protections, but eventually that part at least changed. I think it was just this was part of the New Deal, major legislation in our country that was happening during a period when slavery was still not far in the rearview window. So I think that, most of the deals that Congress made at that time were to sort of appease Southern Democrats, and a lot of the exclusions of farm workers that remain today are rooted in slavery because the powers that be wanted to exclude former slaves from being protected by a lot of this legislation. I mean, back then, the population of a traditional farm worker was a little bit different than it is today.
That's so interesting, because I don't think people readily put that together, the history of slavery with the condition of migrant farm workers now.
Carries on today. And the National Labor Relations Act, which is the major law that also gives any worker the right to kind of get together with your coworkers and demand better working conditions, or a lot of people think of that as unionizing. Farm workers are not protected from unionizing. They are not protected if they get together with their coworkers and complain about working conditions in the same way as all other workers and low-wage workers. And in a lot of states like Tennessee, farm workers continue to be excluded from workers' compensation coverage. So if you're injured on the job, an agricultural employer is not required to pay for your injury, even if it was the direct result. And there's really no reason, frankly, for farm workers to be excluded other than for reasons that were originally rooted in racism.
That is amazing that is still in place, that those old laws are still in place. One thing I wanted to ask you both about was, what is the kind of work that people are doing? Because I think when we hear about farm workers, we think they're picking fruits and vegetables. But I know you had mentioned the people that were working on a chicken farm because there were immunity issues around COVID.
Yes, actually.
So what kinds of work are people doing when we're talking about migrant farm workers?
On the farm that I used to work, it was a cattle farm. So it was just livestock, cows, dealing with them, giving medicine, making sure, they still growing healthy, to go to the sale barn whenever we were weaning them. We have other people working in Kentucky at the Kentucky farm with the chicken farms. And then that was a big issue because, as you know, big chicken farms they have thousands and thousands of chickens. And sometimes when you go inside those houses, the smell is so like strong. The people with like health issues or people with like breathing problems, they cannot be there for too long, or they will get even more sick. Because you just pretty much smelling the poop of the chicken, and like everything, they just like the litter, and like there's thousands of chickens that like you cannot really control how much it goes into your lungs. So that's what they do in Kentucky. And then we have the hog farm in South Carolina, but like I said, in South Carolina. And then again, working with animals is not as clean as sometimes, picking veggies and like fruit. It can get really messy really quick. And in my part, working with like the cows, there was no day that I would come out of the farm like clean.
I can imagine.
And then sometimes we had to be careful because when we got sick or when we were, prompt to get sick, we had to make sure that we didn't inhale like any of the toxic, like for example, like the cow's poop, or like we didn't touch anything like that, because then we'll go home and they have to, take a bath and like take a shower and then eat, and then sometimes in our lunch hours at the farm, we have to be really careful not to, be dirty, because then we'll be like touching stuff that will probably end up in our stomachs. So I don't know. I personally haven't worked in like a vegetable farm or like a fruit farm, but I'm sure that they, if you have more experience with, farmers like that, I'm sure that they run with the same issues, especially because it's not a job that will recommend to be like working there for, the rest of your life. So, yeah.
I'm also wondering if you all know if things are unique or different in Tennessee than in the other states that you're working with, or that you've, witnessed, other states in the South?
I would say the situation in Tennessee is about on par with, what we see in other areas. The South tends to have a lot of the same issues with lack of state law. So most of the laws that we rely on are federal laws, because there are not state level laws that would protect workers in a way. Other states would have like a minimum wage that might be higher than the federal minimum wage, or they might have discrimination protections that are greater than what federal law provides for. But generally in Tennessee, like most of the South, there aren't state level laws that would be more protective than what the federal government offers.
And is that, again, what you were saying as a legacy of slavery? Perhaps.
Yeah, I think, just more pro-business, less pro-worker.
And do you feel like you see these issues covered in the media? Are these things the public knows about, or is this kind of hidden?
Personally, I think we just see on the TV what they want us to see, and then sometimes they just don't show every single detail. Especially like with farmers in California, with the whole, situation that we just had with like they were bringing farmers from Mexico to work here, temporarily farmers, like temporary workers. They don't usually tell you that on the news. They usually don't tell you, we have people coming from other countries right now, helping us, get this country still, moving when we're like all shut down. They don't tell you that. They just tell you it's like, oh, we're doing good, our economic is going great, but they don't show you or tell you who's responsible for that. They don't show you like the faces, or like the immigrants are like pretty much sacrificing some of their lives and families to be here and working here. It's unbelievable how much they want you to believe, and then how different it's from the actual reality. So it is sad. So
yeah, I would definitely agree. It's actually surprising and shocking. Everyone has to eat every day. And I think it's very few people that think about, how did this apple get, from the field to my plate? How did this squash get here? How did these berries get picked and, put into this little plastic container for me? And those are human beings who are, marching through the fields on a daily basis. In the South, we're talking about 90, 100-degree heat. And workers are out there, from dawn till dusk, if not later. And, their body is getting scratched up by the thorns and they day in and day out, someone is out there sweating and pulling that fruit and vegetables, off of the plant for you. And people don't think about that. And I think people would be shocked and surprised to see sort of the living and working conditions that, the people that we employ to provide us with this food, how they're living and being treated on a daily basis. More people, and they're in rural areas, right? So they're very much isolated. They're in very rural areas. A lot of them don't speak English. They're not accessing, resource. They're very isolated, and people should think more about where their food is coming from, for sure.
I am so grateful to both of you for being here today. We're out of time, but really, this has been so valuable to hear both your points of view. Thank you so much. I want to thank both these panelists and the Just Conversation series and the National Museum of African American Music for hosting us here. And thanks for tuning in to our episode. And if you want to watch more Just Conversations episodes, go to www.justconversations.org.